Hi everyone, my name is McLaughlin and I am a PhD candidate in neuroscience at the University of Pennsylvania. And again, like last week, I'm going to open up with two studies that I found fascinating before getting to some live streaming. But YouTube is currently down, so I can't be live right now on YouTube, but soon to be live on Twitter. And if you hear any kind of lovely little coos and gaahs, that is because I have procreated and the products of that procreation are nearby. So yeah, it's just not some random baby that lives in my apartment with me. It's my baby. Under the very astute and able care of my wife. Okay, so the first study focuses on the microbiome. And so this was a study that was done at Oregon State University. And the lead grad student, Courtney Armour, I believe is how you pronounce her last name. She and her team focused not only on which organisms compose the microbiome, but also what functions they might be performing. And so they did what's called a metagenomic study, which is basically an analysis of samples collected directly from the topic of study, right, and had been used in other studies. And it's sometimes referred to as environmental genomics or community genomics. And so this is different from what you might see more typically in like microbiology studies or just genomic studies, in that those studies tend to isolate samples of cellular populations, or just have petri dishes that are populated by specific types of bacteria or microbes, or like a specific human cell line. Oops. So it's basically just the application of genomic sequencing technologies, but at a broader level. And so you can analyze the genetics of more contributing sources than just one cell line or in just one person. And so this group collected fecal samples from just about 2,000 people, again, as opposed to evaluating the microbial genetics from just one sample of one person. And so it's worth noting that according to this paper, this is the first analysis of its kind, and maybe because of that, they have identified specific microbial functions that distinguished people who had diseases from those who didn't, just had diseases or did not have diseases. And so one of their interesting findings was that they found some microbial functions that were common across multiple diseases. And in fact, there were actually relatively few microbes that were unique to any given disease. And so I have an example of how they plot some of that data, and these images or these kind of schematics can seem really complex. There's a lot of data being plotted there, but they're not really not best used to hone in on any specific microbial population. It's more to just show relationships here. And so these data, along with the rest of their paper, suggest that there might be some microbes that contribute to multiple diseases, or just having disease in general, being susceptible to a disease, with the possibility of targeting them to improve other treatments, right? To improve any standard treatment. So in other words, different disease processes, like, just an example, like liver cirrhosis or Crohn's disease, may result from similar changes in the gut microbiome, or they may both contribute to similar changes in the microbiome. And so, interestingly, there was this unique constellation of gut microbes that may, just as an example, may appear in people with like type 2 diabetes and obesity. But that unique constellation is driven by the fact that people with diseases may have similar lifestyle factors. Like it just so happens that people with obesity may eat comparatively more simple carbohydrates, and because of the relatively higher abundance of simple carbohydrates, similar microbes will tend to thrive. But perhaps less intuitively, they may have also found a new way to diagnose a person's disease status, basically by sampling and profiling their fecal matter, rather than what we use today, the sort of standard diagnostic approaches. And so I'm not sure that they'd argue that they could identify whether someone's at risk of developing a disease before any symptoms present. I don't know if they think they could predict that someone would develop a disease earlier than a standard physician. But, with that said, I don't think it's a stretch to suspect that this kind of an approach might be helpful in that way, in sort of crafting a more personalized medicine that's sensitive to biological variability that we know exists between different people who have, different genetic backgrounds, different lifestyles and diets, and, different environments in which they live, and so on. So it is it's exciting to see this kind of study being done, because it probably brings us quite a bit closer to a translational application of evaluating microbiomes. Okay, so the second study, which was done at Loma Linda University, suggests that different parenting styles can be tied to different health outcomes later on in life. And so in particular, this group focused on telomeres, which you can see sort of modeled here, kind of in these floating chromosomes. And so the baby loves chromosomes. And so chromosomes, as I'm sure many of you are aware, are the unit of storage of all the DNA. It's how the DNA is stored. And so we have 23 pairs, 46 altogether, 23 of which we get from each of our parents. And so the source of the voice you just heard has 23 of my chromosomes. And so because of the way that our genes are expressed, because of the way that the little molecular machines, which enzymes, interact with our DNA, every single time each chromosome is replicated during cellular division, a small amount of chromosomal DNA is lost. And so fortunately, our chromosomes evolved to have these little protective caps, these little telomeres. And so that's basically what a telomere is, just basically a bunch of repetitive nonsense DNA, and it doesn't code for anything. But it gives us some elbow room to lose some DNA every time something like a skin cell divides, for example. And so that said, telomeres are only so long, and as we get older, even the telomeres, those stretches of DNA begin to run out. And so at a certain point, a cell will enter into a period that we call senescence, where basically it just stops dividing. And so if you're interested in aging and some of the strategies that some companies are trying to use to enable us to live healthier for longer, check out the most recent episode of my podcast called Wired to be Weird, and it's on iTunes and Stitcher and Spotify and all the rest. So back to the study. This group found that adults who reported being raised by parents, and I think they focused specifically on mothers, who employed what they would call a cold style, had on average 25% smaller telomeres than those who described their mother's parenting as warm. And, other studies have shown a relationship between early life stress and shortened telomeres, right? So that is not a surprise. But this study, which was retrospective, focused on data from 200 subjects who participated in two studies, the first of which was back in 1976, and it was with tens of thousands of people, and then the second of which was with even more participants between 2002 and 2007. And so, interestingly, the group didn't only consider maternal parenting style. They also evaluated potential relationships between things like level of education or body mass index or BMI. But, according to the study, quote, the association with parenting style was greatest among those with less education and those who stayed overweight or obese or put on weight during follow-ups, suggesting both higher education and normal BMI may provide some resilience against cold parenting and cellular aging. And so, end quote. So it can be really difficult to know just how significant the parenting style specifically is to this effect on telomere length, telomeric length. So as we noted earlier, we know that early life stress has a similar effect in shortening telomeres. And there have been some studies that hone in on how this might work biochemically, like biochemical mechanisms for this, but without having a kind of biochemical or molecular mechanism here to explain this effect, we're left to kind of speculate until more granular molecular biology can be done. And so, on that same note, while we know levels of education can influence things like longevity and the rate of onset of dementia, it can also those things can also be indirect indicators of things like wealth or nutrition or social support, all of which have important effects on longevity and in some cases effects on telomere length. And so as a new parent myself, as you can hear, the intuitive question to ask is whether this means that choosing to allow a toddler to cry a bit before swooping in and comforting her, while ensuring, of course, that nutrition and education are optimal, would that be deleterious to physiology like telomere length? In other words, if everything else in their life is as good as can be, is letting them cry a little bit before you swoop in to comfort them, will that still deliver some kind of detriment to their health? And so, for me at this point, it's tough to say, at least with these data alone. But given how much we've learned about the biomedical ramifications of just sort of chronic general stress, this study certainly doesn't suggest that the advantages of that type of cold parenting might outweigh the potential disadvantages. So I am not going to necessarily change my parenting style all that much. It's, I think, safe to say that neither my wife nor I imply a kind of cold approach. In fact, we're probably a little bit too early to swoop in. But this is just some evidence to suggest that, beyond the sort of psychological outcomes that, have been speculated for decades and decades, there may be a more specific and perhaps problematic physiological effect on things like cellular aging or telomere length. Okay, so let's get this live stream started. Boom and boom. She's become a lot more vocal recently, which is lovely. It actually is, to sort of like listen to her explore new ways to vocalize and moving her mouth at the same time. She started doing this. Well, I should start the live stream. Okay. Okie dokie. Hello, everyone. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Pennsylvania over here in Philadelphia. And if you hear any kind of lovely little coos or gaas or giggles, if we're lucky, that is because I have procreated recently, and you will be hearing the fruits of my procreation. Fear not if you hear any kind of wailing, because she is under the very capable care of my wife. At least for now. I think they might be going on a walk soon, given that the weather has kind of turned for the better recently. So I spoke a little bit about two studies, one focused on the effects of the microbiome and just sort of disease predispositions or just disease status in general, as well as the effect of cold parenting on telomere length. I talked about those on YouTube. I know YouTube's down right now, but you can check them out if you like. I think you just search, Ian Anthropoid Brain or something like that, and you'll come up with it. So if you're interested, go check it out. Let me know what you think. Okay. Hey, can you make some money for me? Yes? No, probably not. Hello, I missed you. I will ask you all my questions when I remember them again. Well, I look forward to hearing them or seeing them. Please address the issue of chronic pain patients not getting meds they need. Yeah, Jans. So this is definitely a topic that I think is poorly handled by folks who are interested or even affected by the opioid overdose epidemic. And so what we're talking about here is a relationship between, of course, health, right? Biomedical management of pain, government policy with regards to how we regulate the prescriptions of things like oxycodone or fentanyl, and basically just society, right? People who use these drugs recreationally or user abuse, whatever word you want to use. And so what has happened is that because of this unprecedented acceleration in the number of people who are overdosing and dying from opioids, the regulatory bodies have kind of applied the same logic that they apply to basically all drugs, all abusable drugs. And that is, more people are dying from this specific category of drugs. We know that they are prescribed, and so if we reduce the availability, that ought to reduce the frequency that people overdose. It's sort of, on first pass, of course, it makes sense, right? The problem, however, is that, first of all, there is no solid evidence to suggest that the people who are overdosing from these medications are actually overdosing from prescribed opioids. In other words, the people who are, tragically overdosing and dying, they're not getting these opioids from their physicians. They're not being prescribed these medications. Of course, it happens sometimes, but far less frequently than people sourcing them illicitly, right, or stealing them, or just buying them on the black market or whatever. So, in other words, by and large, people who are prescribed opioids are not who are driving this acceleration in the number of people who are overdosing and dying. So that's one issue with that logic, with clamping down on how available they are via prescription. The second problem, however, is that a lot of physicians, they don't necessarily know the nuances or understand the nuances of addiction nor pain management. The relationship between prescribing opioids or prescription decision making and pain management has been fraught for a very long time. Physicians were not necessarily trained to understand addiction or substance, dependence, nor, early on, for a period of time, physicians were kind of instructed to recognize pain as kind of like the as of yet unrecognized, vital sign. And so basically, if a patient was in pain and you didn't prescribe opioids, that would be considered malpractice. And that has since stopped. But unfortunately, the pendulum has swung all the way to the other side, and to such an extent where there's sort of a chilling effect on physicians prescribing opioids. And so you get, circumstances where a patient just had surgery, just had invasive, painful surgery, and their physicians will refuse to prescribe pain medication for fear of being identified as a pill mill or as a reckless, physician. And so, and then, even further, there are some folks for whom, opioid painkillers are essentially the thing that enables them to live independently. People with conditions like multiple sclerosis or just chronic pain, chronic inflammation, an injury, back injury, whatever it might be. And at least up until now, they have adapted to the effects of those injuries or of those conditions by using a painkiller, an opioid painkiller. They're not really using it. They're not using it for any recreational purpose, just out of enjoyment. They just need it. Otherwise, they cannot function independently. And the baby hates that circumstance. And so as a result, they have nowhere else to turn, right? They've followed all the rules. They've done everything that they're supposed to do. And now they're in a situation where they are bereft of their medication. Their physicians refuse to prescribe what they've become accustomed to, become dependent upon, to just live independently. And so the only source of their medication left are, unfortunately, some of the most, unscrupulous members of society, people who just will sell tainted batches of heroin or tainted, fake oxycodone pills that are tainted with fentanyl. Fentanyl being like the single biggest contributor to opioid overdose fatalities. And that's a huge problem. And so we know, we can predict statistically that if this kind of very punitive strategy is employed, you can statistically predict that the number of overdose fatalities is going to increase. And so that is not a problem solved. That is a problem exacerbated. And up until fairly recently, there haven't been many voices advocating for chronic pain patients or for patients that are using them legitimately or just need them. Now that conversation is becoming a little bit more diverse. And so I am 100%, sympathetic to what a lot of people who, imagine how fearful you'd become if you cannot live independently without this medication. By the way, also, a lot of people, inaccurately or, maliciously will view you as an addict because you need this medication to function. Think about how fearful you would be if all of a sudden you no longer have access to that medication. And so, I think it's a huge problem. It's great to see more, presidential candidates and politicians in general recognize that the opioid overdose epidemic is a serious problem, unprecedented problem in this country. But I think that this is a problem that warrants a nuanced approach, and unfortunately I'm not seeing a lot of that nuance being discussed at the sort of regulatory level, at the political level. I'm sorry to hear it sounds like you might be personally affected by this, Jans. Hey, best to get sick? No, is to just throw heavy nonsense away. Yeah, I'm in favor of throwing nonsense away. Congratulations on the baby. Thank you very much. Tammy West wishes. Thank you so much. Man, you look tired. I am tired. You became a father. Yes, I did. A girl. Baby girl. All right. Hey, man, I was waiting for your stream. Oh, well, here I am. Thanks for hanging out. Unfortunately, YouTube is down, but Twitter's better than YouTube anyways. Okay. She has, for months, been afraid to go out due to false feelings of having to go to the restroom. Oh, wow. I know that can be a symptom of a lot of different conditions, like diabetes, for example. Okay. Let's see. Resistant to painkillers is scary. And that is another issue in this conversation, is that we know that there are, most people who are prescribed and take an opioid never become dependent upon them, never develop an addiction. And we also know, we can predict who is more or less likely to find the effects of opioids rewarding and therefore is vulnerable to developing addiction. Again, the vast majority of people are not. They take an opioid and they cannot wait to stop taking it, or they just don't really, so long as the pain isn't ailing them, they're fine with or without it. But there is, unfortunately, a subset of people who are genetically prone to opioid addiction. And then, of course, genetics aren't the only thing that determine whether or not someone develops an addiction, ever. They're never the only thing, but they are a very significant thing. Okay. So let's see. Oh, no. Scientists pull speech directly from the brain. Are you involved in this research? So when you say, the Smiths, when you say scientists pull speech directly from the brain, I guess you could mean a couple different things. So that could mean that, language or speech arises directly from the brain, and that is true. I guess you could also be implying that, is it possible for scientists to decipher brain activity using something like fMRI, and essentially, without a person speaking, scientists can tell you what they're saying or what they would intend to say. I'm not quite sure in which direction you would want to go. Okay. I have a really important question. Why are you doing this? Like the streams. That's a great question. I've had to ask myself that several times. So it's something that I just did randomly. For the first time a few years ago, I and my girlfriend at the time, we were going on a walk in Philly, and I had been using the app. It was still pretty new at that time. And I just sort of like, wow, this is so cool. You can like have dinner with people in like, whatever, the Philippines, and next moment, hang out with people in Russia. And, like that was really interesting to me. But then my girlfriend went to take a shower and just, I had some time on my own. And so I just pointed the camera back at me and just said, hey, I study the brain. What do you want to talk about? And very rapidly, it was clear that a lot of people were interested in that topic. And so I just kept doing it. And so long as people are interested, I'm interested in participating, because I think that a very critical problem with the way that science, the relationship that people have outside of science with science, is that if you're not already interested in it, then nobody's really trying to talk to you, right? In other words, like nobody who does science is meeting people where they are. Rather, they'll make a TV show, or they'll, build a museum, or have a museum, exhibit or something, where generally speaking, the people who are interested in science, they're already interested, right? And generally speaking, they're pretty well informed. And so I am interested in exploring these other kind of avenues to interact with people. Okay, cool. I am so happy. Well, thank you very much. Good to see you, Mew app. Hope all is well with you. Are meditation apps actually proven to be beneficial, or another fad like those brain training apps? Yeah, Bank. Awesome topic. So first of all, when it comes to those like cognitive training apps, I don't want to name any companies, but there was a study that was done here at Penn. It was like a cognitive neuroscience study. So people, using fMRI to test whether or not there was any measurable, quantifiable improvement in cognitive performance following the use of, one of those cognitive training apps. It was one of the most prominent ones. And their hypothesis, the group's hypothesis, was that, they would at least be able to measure some improvement in cognitive performance on various tests, like, remembering a list of words, or being able to recite, as many words that start with the letter B, for example. And to their surprise, and I suspect to their chagrin, they found no improvement whatsoever. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that those apps are totally useless. It definitely does not mean that. What it does indicate, however, is that what those companies claim probably is almost certainly an exaggeration. And that it's always a bad sign when a company just peppers in random neuroscience terms, or just the term neuroscience, because it's like, based on neuroscience in what way? Like, it's not like any, there are very few groups in neuroscience who are like actively developing apps for the purpose of cognitive training. Anyway, we can talk about that a little bit more. There are some groups who are, but it could just mean that we just don't have the right test to reveal the improvements. Like, the improvements are happening, and if you're only looking under, the street lamp for your keys that you dropped on the sidewalk, you're only going to be able to see within the illuminated area of the sidewalk. You're not going to be able to see outside of where the light is illuminating. It's the street light effect is what I'm referring to here. Okay, so now, when it comes to meditation apps, so, there's sort of two components to this, right? The first is are there any bona fide or any genuine benefits to meditation? And I'm happy to go into that a little bit more if you're interested, but the short answer is yes, there are some, and the degree to which meditation is physiologically beneficial, I'm not talking about psychologically. I mean, that is fairly well established, but in terms of like mitigating chronic stress, which can have an effect on physiology, there's some good evidence to suggest that yes, something like mindfulness meditation does yield benefits in terms of like reducing the release of glucocorticoids during chronic stress, or those types of indirect effects on biochemistry or just physiology. Okay, so now meditation apps. I am not aware of any actual rigorously performed studies of any meditation app. And again, I don't want to name any names specifically, but there are a couple now that are pretty prominent. Oftentimes they advertise on like podcasts and stuff like that. She's gotten so much more vocal, as you can tell. We definitely encourage it, by the way. She's so cute. Okay, so in the absence of those studies, I think, frankly, we should just wait until those studies are done before we can say confidently whether or not any one of those apps, and not all the apps are the same, are an effective delivery mechanism of the benefits of meditation. But now I'll put my speculation hat on. Yeah, I think probably, right? Meditation is a fairly simple thing to do. Guided meditation is fairly simple to reproduce, via an app. It's not like you're trying to, recapitulate education, right? As a cognitive training app would purportedly be able to do, right? You're just trying to recapitulate somebody either just fostering a kind of calm atmosphere or providing some kind of guided, recorded audio meditation. And yeah, so I would be shocked. I don't know, she's become so much more. She does also I'm talking about the baby now. She tends to vocalize more when I'm talking. So right now she's trying to participate in the conversation. Anyways, so can I tell you with sufficient confidence that yes or no, a meditation app is going to be effective at delivering the active ingredient, whatever it is, of the benefits of meditation? I can't tell you for sure. I would be surprised if they couldn't. Okay. All right. She's not crying. This is not her crying. You'll know she's crying. Can you break through to the matrix? Can you break through, let's say, the matrix in the brain when you meditate? The matrix is all around us. It's everywhere you look. It depends on what you're using. The matrix is obviously a metaphor for conformity, or the broader systems that control our lives that we don't even notice. I don't know why she's being so vocal right now, but yeah, metaphorically speaking, yes. Okay, why do I know I'm not mentally okay, and where I need help versus the people who are blinded, who need it too? Well, different psychiatric conditions are associated with different levels of being debilitated. This is probably the most vocal she's been in weeks. Okay, she started this new thing, and we're getting so derailed. I'm sorry about that. But listen, you can't control all these things, right, as a parent. But she started this new thing where she goes, ah, ah. It's like her new favorite sound, although it sounds like she's developed a new favorite sound. Okay. Yeah, so not all psychiatric conditions are the same, right? So, debilitating depression is not the same as, psychosis, or not the same as bipolar disorder. There are periods, and not all cases of depression are the same. In fact, oftentimes people who are experiencing well, to give you perhaps a more intuitive example, people with obsessive compulsive disorder oftentimes know. So obsessive compulsive disorder is a psychiatric condition where people will oftentimes engage in rituals like excessively cleaning their hands, or turning on and off a light switch repeatedly to avoid some kind of future doom, right? What's interesting about this, and I've read explanations about this, but also I've spoken to people who've been diagnosed with OCD, and they're very open about the fact that they know it's totally irrational, right? That flipping on and off the light switch frequently, or a specific number of times isn't going to prevent their mother from dying, right? Or they know that their hands are perfectly clean. They know that they're washing their hands for an irrational reason. However, they engage in that ritual regardless. So it is very common that somebody will be well aware of the fact that their behavior is irrational. Another maybe even more intuitive example is addiction, right? Which is near and dear to what I study as a PhD candidate, wrapping up my dissertation, where people, really, really want to stop smoking cigarettes, or they hate the fact that they get sick if they don't inject heroin, but they continue engaging in that behavior regardless. They know that their life would be, categorically better if they were able to stop smoking, but they still won't. Or can't, depending on how you want to frame it, right? They can't. And so, that's just another example of people who they're well aware that they need help, or they're well aware that they should engage in one behavior, but they do another regardless. The human brain is not an engine of rationality. In fact, we're rather irrational. And, we're capable of something like cognitive dissonance, holding to either beliefs or desires that are mutually exclusive simultaneously. So you just happen to be in such a situation where you're aware that you have some kind of psychiatric distress, you're aware that there's help out there available for you, and you engage that help. That's good. But it doesn't mean that that people who don't are somehow less than, or, are somehow, they have lower willpower or something like that. It's not that simple. Who is Ian? I am Ian. I'm a PhD candidate in neuroscience at the University of Pennsylvania, writing my dissertation as we speak. In fact, the whiteboard right in front of my face has all the various parts of my dissertation that have been completed and have yet to be completed. So, nice house. It's a rather small apartment, but I appreciate it. What's up, NYC boy? Can 12-year-old boys get pregnant from reading too much comic books? The short answer is no. Otherwise, I probably would have become pregnant. Do you agree that cutting one's meds down 50% is not good for the body? I mean, it totally depends on the medication. Jans, I believe you're probably referring to opioids, because you've previously brought up the topic of physicians refusing or becoming a little bit stingier with their opioid prescriptions. No, I don't think it's categorically good or bad. That's really a decision that's best made between the patient and his or her physician. And so, in some cases, if, oxycodone, okay, in some cases, if, none of these medications for the majority of cases are intended to be prescribed for very, very long periods of time. It is only rare cases, and there are certainly cases where a patient's quality of life can be improved so dramatically by just having a regular prescription of oxycodone. So that is a unique patient cohort. What we're talking about, if somebody's trying to cut down their medications, is that they have arthritis, or they have some kind of surgery, some kind of orthopedic surgery, or their wisdom teeth have been taken out, or something like that. And for the post-surgery acute pain, they have a certain prescription of oxycodone or whatever, and then the goal is to stop taking it because the source of the pain should be ameliorated over time. And so you cut your dose down. Or for some people don't want to take oxycodone, don't want to take opioids, but they've been prescribed. When it comes to oxycodone and opioids in general, the range of potential dose is so wide because people develop a substance dependence so rapidly. And so what would be a dose that would probably kill me could be a dose that is taken every day by a chronic pain patient. If somebody's been taking 180 or 160 milligrams of oxycodone every day, cutting that to zero is going to be extraordinarily difficult, and the withdrawal syndrome is going to be very severe. And by the way, the source of their pain is going to be exacerbated. You enter part of the opioid withdrawal syndrome is hyperalgesia. And so, no, I think that's a responsible way to handle this if your goal is to eventually cut your dose down as much as possible, or perhaps zero. Thank you very much, Leonora. Enjoy. I saw you earlier. It's good to see you too. USA have big salary there. Well, certainly not graduate students. What really happens in the brain when someone has an enlightenment experience without drugs? Well, frankly, so Mark Manchester United, that's a very interesting topic. And the short answer, at least, I can't tell you 100% for sure, but the short answer is they're probably quite similar, actually, because that feeling of profundity, right, that feeling of I just had a profound, important, life-changing thought or experience, that is almost akin to a sensory experience, right? It's not sensory, it's not part of the sensory nervous system, but it is a feeling that is produced in the brain. So, we evolved to both remember and forget, right? You can remember something or you can forget something. And generally speaking, the brain is constantly making that determination whether or not your current experience is worthy of remembering. Because you only, this is kind of a shorthand explanation, but your brain has only so many resources. The brain is extraordinarily expensive, evolutionarily speaking, biologically speaking. We have to consume a ton of calories just to keep our brain at a certain temperature. So we don't have infinite. We do theoretically have infinite storage, but we didn't evolve to exploit the brain in that way, right? The brain is constantly optimizing, and so you are making the determination whether or not a given experience or thought or memory or not thought or experience is worthy of remembering. And part of that process is the feeling, the sensation of profundity. And so a drug, there are many drugs that are known to neuropsychopharmacologically induce that feeling. In fact, oftentimes there's a sort of stereotype. Cannabis is certainly capable of doing this. And there's a stereotype of like the Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, like, whoa, at relatively mundane things, right? Everything is so important. And it's because actually that mechanism of whether or not a thought or an experience is profound is regulated by the endogenous cannabinoid signaling system. And so you're basically just like flipping the switch. And so all of a sudden, all of your experiences are profound. That's also true for psychedelics. Very similar type of thing where every experience seems to be so important. You're so connected to everything, all that kind of stuff. And then, experiencing that sensation, that profundity, independently of any drugs, it's the same mechanism. It just so happens that the drugs are interfering with that mechanism in such a way as to promote that feeling, whereas to get it to get it, without being under the influence of any medication, you have to engage the environment in some way, right? Go to the Grand Canyon, go to Notre Dame, go to some amazing, highly unique place where you're going to have a highly unique experience because that is what the system evolved to determine. Interesting, awesome topic. What is the best food for brain health? Well, Jackie, the short answer, I keep saying the short answer. Short answer is that there's no specific food, no one single food that is optimal in all respects. Thank you very much for the Super Hearts, Joy. I really appreciate it. Rather, it is a diverse, competent diet, right? So there are certain kinds of diets that are better than others, right? So, for example, a diet that's very high in simple carbohydrates or sugar, bad for the brain. There's basically no evidence to suggest that it's good for the brain. And unfortunately, the Western diet, as it's sometimes called, the standard American diet, is extremely high in carbohydrates in general, simple carbohydrates in particular. And this is a byproduct of some really interesting public health policy history that we can go into if you'd like. But suffice it to say that in the 70s, everybody decided that fat was bad for you, and there was an inordinate, disproportionate response to fat and heart disease. Anyways, so having a competent distribution of proteins, fats, and carbohydrates is better than having all of one thing or just eating whatever you want, but also eating a lot of blueberries. Now, more on diet after this. We have oh no, wait, I lost you. Would you call back in? So let's get to it. So there are, however, some, let's say, ingredients, some herbs and spices that have been shown to be beneficial in, for example, staving off the onset of dementia. That being turmeric. So turmeric is like almost uniquely has been shown, and a specific ingredient or active ingredient within turmeric called curcumin has been shown to correlate with reduced onsets of dementia, staving off the onset of dementia, improved cognitive health later on in life. And so it's being evaluated for potential applications. It has been evaluated and it continues to be evaluated for potential applications in treating dementia. And so now we went into a couple other things, like, for example, resveratrol on my podcast, which is called Wired to be Weird. Wired to be Weird on iTunes and Stitcher, and Patreon at patreon.com/anthropoid. Okay. FDA should regulate salt and sugar content, spend billions on diabetes and heart disease. So, I mean, they do in some respects, right? It is required, or the USDA perhaps requires that certain foods have to indicate the contents of, the breakdown, the macronutritional breakdown of fats, proteins and carbohydrates. The girls are going for a walk. Everybody say goodbye. But listen, I agree with you. Broadly speaking, I agree with you that the relationship between society and nutrition is extraordinarily dysfunctional. However, I would submit to you that I think there is a sort of a looming, invisible issue that we are sort of dealing with without knowing it. And that is that right now, in industrial agriculture, where most of our food comes from, it is very, very common to use various pesticides, fungicides, insecticides, and so on, to boost their yield, their crop yield, which is totally understandable. In fact, about 40,000 of these chemicals is approved by the EPA and I think USDA for the use in industrial agriculture. However, a shocking number of them have not been evaluated for their effects on mammalian cells, just even like in a petri dish. And some recent studies performed by, I keep bringing them up, but I think it's an important category of research by a guy named Mark Zilka down in North Carolina showed that it seems that some of these molecules can interact with the proteins, the genes of which have been implicated in autism. And he evaluated changes in broad morphology, anatomy of the brain, and it did indeed, after being exposed to these molecules, did begin to reflect the architecture that we see in folks with autism. So, I think you're right that the relationship between nutrition and society is totally dysfunctional, but I think at least there's some awareness. For me, I think, for my dollar, I would rather the FDA or the USDA or the EPA or all of them together form some kind of body that's capable of reviewing these molecules. Yeah. Okay. Off my soapbox. In America, it is worth with genetically modified, sorry to say. So genetically modified organisms are way, way more common than people suspect. And so, I am sympathetic to the argument, to the skepticism of genetically modified organisms in food. I think, it makes sense. And in fact, if I didn't have an education in biology, I'd probably use that same exact logic. And it's probably, gonna keep you fairly healthy. But there is a ton of misunderstanding of what a genetically modified organism is and how and why it can be dangerous. So, eating a genetically modified strawberry, it's not gonna hurt you. In fact, if you're eating strawberries and you get them from the grocery store, there's like a 99.9% probability that you are getting genetically modified organisms, regardless of whether or not they're organic. By the way, so regardless of that, this is true for essentially every single food that we buy and eat, whether they're organically produced or not, free range, whatever. Now, and those foods in and of themselves are not, there's no evidence that they're detrimental to health. However, there can be a problem where, environmentally speaking, right, sometimes you'll, and this is just a totally hypothetical example, but let's just talk about strawberries. If you produce a strawberry that grows to be this big, right, and they demand a whole ton more phosphorus or nitrogen or whatever in the soil, you're going to deplete the soil of those resources faster, and it can be an untenable situation moving forward, right? Are you going to be able to continue to grow food there or not? But then I think a little bit further down the line is where I begin to join hands with those who are skeptical of genetically modified organisms. And this is a recent case that has been, I think, decided about glyphosate or Roundup, where essentially a company, I just won't mention it, just whatever, I don't want to be sued, genetically modified some organisms to be impervious to the effects of a pesticide, which would normally kill the plants had they not been modified. And so they could use this pesticide on, just sort of wantonly and improve their yields. Unfortunately, and this was under the assumption that it had no net deleterious effects on human health. And unfortunately, that has not proven to be the case. And so, I think just putting all of these things under the same umbrella of genetically modified organisms, I think misses the point, because you then are sort of blind to genuine, authentic cases where its utilization is damaging to human health, directly damaging to human health. Okay. How do you spell that last name? Mark Zylka. Yeah, Zylk. Mark Zylka. You kind of look like the poor man's Nick Wright. I don't know who that is, but I probably, if that person is wealthy, you're right, I am. MIT, Dr. Stephanie Seneff. Ground-breaking glyphosate studies in mimics glycine. It is... yeah, it's alarming. And by the way, that is a very specific case. I mean, the company that produced that technology was under a ton of scrutiny. Some of it warranted, a lot of it warranted, a lot of it unwarranted, and a byproduct of misunderstanding genetically modified organisms. But, the end result is that it's going to be impossible. If your goal is to just ban genetically modified organisms, it's going to be impossible. And the benefits won't be commensurate with the effort required. Rather, I think we should empower an agency of some sort, or just require that an agency like the EPA or the FDA or the USDA review all of the chemicals that are used in agriculture and just test whether or not they're harmful, at least in vitro, at least in mammalian cells in a petri dish. If I were the president, that is something that I would do. And I would campaign against even members of my own party who disagreed. All right, DMT, do you know? I do indeed. DMT, dimethyltryptamine. We can talk about it however you would like. Oh, DMT effects. Okay, well, the effects are fairly simple. DMT, dimethyltryptamine, is an analog of tryptamine in that it has dimethyls on the amine. It has two methyl groups attached to the nitrogen containing part of the molecule. Tryptamine, very similar to tryptophan, so that relationship renders it capable of interacting with parts of the brain that typically interact with serotonin. And in fact, dimethyltryptamine will change the way that serotonin itself is trafficked. Of course, serotonin, a monoamine neurotransmitter, one of the most broadly transmitted, regulates everything from mood to appetite and satiety to energy levels, dreams, what else? Oh, and then most importantly for this conversation, our sensory systems. And so as a result, because this molecule is capable of interacting with serotonergic targets, all of those systems can be modified in such a way as to alter our sensory perception, right? That's why you get those classic psychedelic hallucinations, right? Where the walls begin breathing, or there's this geometric patternization that people can experience. It's also, by the way, why mood changes occur when somebody takes, for example, LSD or DMT or any of these psychedelics, and on we go. So, but the nutshell is that it is the shape of the molecule of dimethyltryptamine that renders it capable of binding serotonin receptors and changing the way serotonin itself is trafficked in and out of synapses, thereby altering its ability to bind serotonin receptors. That causes all of these really interesting effects. NHS in the UK, you jealous? It certainly is a better system than we have, unfortunately. Is it possible to read minds, like brain or Wi-Fi, and could send signals to people? So, Mark, I guess I'm not quite sure if you mean, is it possible if we were to integrate technology into the brain, that we would be able to do something like you're talking about? Like, rather than me having to say the sentence, I could just beam it to you and you would experience the thoughts. If you're interested in that topic, the notion of integrating technology, whole brain-computer interfaces, or Neuralink, as one of Elon Musk's companies is endeavoring to do, I have a podcast. It's called Wired to be Weird, and it's on iTunes and Stitcher and Spotify and Google Play, and I should be on Alexa. She's right there, she's listening. And we have 2 episodes devoted to whole brain-computer interfaces. And we go deep. I'm a huge sci-fi dork. In fact, probably that's why I went into science in the first place. And so we have a lot of fun with the topic, but there's a lot to be learned by exploring those waters. So if that's your question, the short story is, yeah, it's theoretically possible. The brain, neurons, communicate with one another via electrochemical signaling. Both the electrical component of neuronal signaling and the chemical component of neuronal signaling obey the laws of physics, just like computers do. And computers are very sensitive to electrical signaling. They are also potentially sensitive to chemical signaling, but you wouldn't even need to be sensitive to the chemical signaling, because if you could record the activities of approximately different, neuroengineers and neuroscientists identify different numbers, but a threshold of, let's say 10 million neurons, you could, and then, you develop some kind of very fancy algorithm, perhaps using machine learning or artificial intelligence of some sort, to decipher those patterns of neuronal firing. then you could definitely interface much more directly both with computers, amplifying things like attention or focus or memory, certainly, or your the access to information that is not necessarily stored locally, but perhaps stored, computer or digitally, electronically. But then also, if two humans have that system, you could directly interface with the humans. Right now, we do read each other's minds, right? Right now, you're reading my mind. You are looking at my face, and humans, a very social primate species, express their internal states very much through their face. And so, if I were sitting here like this, and maybe my voice was down like this, and I sounded like I was upset, you might read my mind and suspect, hey, this guy is in a bad mood. What's going on with him? He seemed malicious or, dangerous in some way, untrustworthy. And so that is you reading my mind. We also read each other's minds by language. Language is perhaps one of the most important evolutionary milestones that Homo sapien passed. And so, but the problem is that there is a restricted bandwidth of that perception, of that mind reading, meaning that, I can only speak so much. Words are only so capable of representing a thought or an idea or an experience. While we're very good at reading each other's emotional states by just looking at each other's faces, it's not a 100% accurate representation of a person's internal mood state. So rather than just looking at my eyebrows, and it is, by the way, eyebrows that are very, very important to evaluating each other's emotional states, rather than looking at that, I could just beam to you my internal mood state, and you could experience it for yourself. So I know I sort of went on a tangent there. Again, we go deep. Particularly, I had the most fun with potential downsides of that technology, and it can get very, very scary. And we went into that on my podcast called Wired to be Weird on iTunes and Stitcher and Spotify and blah, 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 all of them, hopefully, Anchor. Also on my Patreon, patreon.com/anthropoid. And if you are, I know not everybody's in a position to, be able to offer financial support, but if you are, one of the things that I like to do is set up a more, one-on-one conversation about a topic of your interest where I can go deep on that topic. Patreon.com/anthropoid. Did you have an opinion on my nootropics question? I didn't see your original question, Wes, New York City guy. Or just Wes is probably your name. Probably not New York City guy. So, yeah, I certainly have opinions about nootropics. It is probably one of the things that comes up the most frequently for me, understandably. So for anybody that's not familiar, nootropics is a category of supplements, right, that the concept of which was engendered around the 1970s. And it was sort of put forth as a theoretical category of molecules that would be sort of like vitamins for the brain, right? They were good for the brain. They supported brain health. They would amplify human intelligence, human cognition. Again, it was a theoretical category. And within biomedical science today, scientists don't really use that term, right? They only use that term if they are specifically evaluating a nootropic for its nootropic effects. Unfortunately, however, that's not a very common kind of science that's done. There are paltry, there is just not a lot of evidence out there characterizing the efficacy or lack thereof of nootropics. And among the science that has been done, the research that has been done, there's not a lot of supportive evidence, right? Meaning, because of the way that the supplement industry is regulated, they can make all kinds of claims. They can literally sell you a supplement that they've named NZT after the fictional drug from the movie and TV show Limitless, and suggest to you that, hey, you're going to experience a lot of what you saw, what's his name, Bradley Cooper experience in Limitless. And they never have to prove it to you, so long as they're not poisoning you the second you take it, right? It could be bad for you, by the way, but if you can't prove, if it takes many, many months for the effect to take place, and you also maybe drink too much alcohol, or drink any alcohol, or smoke cigarettes, you can't prove that it was a supplement. So supplement industry aside, I'm happy to go into that if you guys are interested. The nootropics industry is not populated by a lot of honest, scrupulous actors. That is not to say that it is bereft of honest, scrupulous actors. In my most recent podcast episode, we talked about a couple companies that are interested, that are selling products devoted to extending lifespan and health span through molecules like nicotinamide riboside, nicotinamide mononucleotide, resveratrol, terastilbene, and on and on and on. If you're interested, podcast is called Wired to be Weird on iTunes and Stitcher. But the short story is they have enlisted, I think between them, over a dozen Nobel laureates, some of whom are actually neuroscientists. And in addition to just Nobel laureates, they have many, many very senior scientists as either advisors or co-founders, and they are funding a lot of research into their products using revenue derived from their supplement sales. But they are the exception to the rule, which is most supplement companies aren't interested in proving to you that their supplements work, and that is because they are not financially motivated, incentivized to do that. And so broadly speaking, when it comes to nootropics, piracetam, aniracetam, oxiracetam, bacopa, vinpocetine, all of these various supplements, they don't tend to demonstrate efficacy in people who are under the age of 65, are getting enough sleep, have a reasonably good diet, don't have any diseases, right? You can find evidence that some of them are effective for those groups of people, but they are not the norm. And for most people, they're not worth the money that you would spend on them. All right. What have you used to physically support your own learning? Just caffeine? Yeah. Yep. It's not always possible to determine something by eyebrows. Yeah, right. So yeah, as I'll note our notes, there is now the effect of Botox on the ability to contract muscles. By the way, Botox, I think most broadly is associated with kind of like cosmetic, frivolous surgery, but it's actually proving to be pretty helpful for people that suffer from severe headaches. So NZT was based off of Modafinil, apparently. Well, I mean, yeah, so Modafinil was originally marketed. I think Modafinil is a really interesting case study because it was initially marketed first as a treatment for narcolepsy, but then as a totally unaddictive stimulant. And the reason that I think the marketers of Modafinil felt comfortable making that claim was because they had evidence to suggest that its pharmacology, meaning what it does when it gets into the brain, was distinct from that of other known to be addictive psychomotor stimulants like amphetamine or cocaine or methylphenidate. So Adderall, cocaine, or Ritalin or Concerta. And so, meaning, more specifically, all of those classic psychomotor stimulants elevate catecholamine signaling, in particular dopamine signaling and norepinephrine signaling to a lesser extent, and in some cases a little bit of serotonin signaling as well. They had evidence to suggest that because Modafinil had slightly distinct pharmacological effects, that it wouldn't be as addictive, and so it would be lower. It would have lower abuse liability. Now, since those claims were made and it was applied accordingly, there's evidence to suggest that no, it does exert catecholaminergic effects, not to the same extent of, let's say amphetamine, but it does, in addition to a couple of other pharmacological effects. And the United States Air Force, of course, very interested in effective molecules that sustain energy, sustain focus and motivation for long, super physical or supraphysiological durations, right? Sometimes, you'll have a pilot in something like a U-2 for 14 hours straight, just sitting there, right? That's a long time. It's pretty tough to expect any human to be capable of not just dozing off a little bit. And so they evaluated Modafinil, right? This would be perfect. It has lower abuse liability. It still supports energy. And unfortunately, they showed that Modafinil actually expands reaction time. Of course, another very important component of being a pilot, right? Things can change very rapidly if you're a fighter pilot. And so that is not a nootropic effect. That's not a cognitive enhancement. In fact, it is a cognitive detriment if you are slower to respond to incoming sensory stimuli. Also, sometimes that kind of reaction time can be an indirect indicator of other cognitive deficits, acute cognitive deficits. So, yeah, I have no problem with the notion of an NZT-like drug being speculated or even somebody claiming that at some point we will be able to develop a drug, a molecule that does enhance cognition very significantly. But unfortunately, that movie and then also Lucy relied on the zombie myth that we only use 10% of our brain, and so hey, this drug somehow cranks it up to 100, cranks it up to 11, and now you have a genius. That's just not true. That's a total myth that we only use 10% of our brain. And also, if a drug were to elevate brain activity just generally, totally non-specifically, that would be a drug that induces seizures. Not generally speaking considered to be a cognitive enhancing effect. But theoretically, I think it's totally possible that you'd be able to develop a drug that interacts with the brain in such a way as to optimize things like memory or focus or motivation, right? These are all byproducts of properties of the brain that obey the laws of physics. Okay, how about for me and all the other folks who just want to boost brain function? So what percent of the brain do we use? Of the brain? Spiritus Maximus, that's a cool handle. So we are not limited, biologically, to a certain percentage, so a certain minority of the brain, right? In other words, it's not like there is a boundary beyond which we just haven't learned how to use. There's no like empty lots within the brain. There's no unused real estate. It's all at your disposal. It's all at the brain's disposal, and at any given time, it's changing quite a bit. Even when you're just sitting, if you were to sit in a white room, or just a room with the lights off, you would have brain activity occurring. And by the way, I always think this is worth mentioning because I think it's a big part of the myth, a part of the romance of the myth, which is that if you were to compare my pattern of brain activity when I'm trying to, play the violin. I tried to teach myself the violin. Imagine my folly. And you were to image my brain activity as I'm trying to work through. Aside, when I first started trying to play the violin, I had no idea that you had to like resin up the bow. And I was just like, gosh, how hard do you have to press this bow against the strings to make a sound? And then I was like, oh, they were just like, it was impossible. Anyways, so if you were to compare my pattern of brain activity when I'm trying to play the violin to, Yo-Yo Ma or some, brilliant violinist, they would almost certainly have far less brain activity than I have, right? Because I don't really know how to optimize which neurons are active at any given time. I haven't developed that expertise. If you're talking about somebody who's an expert, who's developed perfect performance in a musical instrument, they didn't do that by just elevating random brain activity. Rather, they reduced brain activity to just the minimal brain activity necessary, right? They're not activating neurons that would cause their elbow to, jerk out like the funky chicken dance, right? Or they're not just activating a bunch of neurons that are devoted to the memory of the time they, tripped and fell, when giving a presentation up in front of their second grade class, right? That would be all very distracting. It would also be more brain activity. Zombie myth. If you just want to boost brain function, right, which is sort of really what people are interested in when they ask, how can I increase the percent of my brain that's active? It's not really, that's not quite the way to think about it that reflects the way our physiology actually supports learning and memory. Rather, it is, unfortunately, practice. It is just exposing yourself to information, developing some kind of routine that sustains your motivation to continue learning and not get distracted. Eliminating distractions from your environment if you're trying to learn new things. That's very, very helpful. Different people can do that in different ways. Some people, for example, listen to music to drown out the sounds of Philadelphia, right beside them. Some people need complete silence. That's my wife. She needs silence. For me, I would lose my mind. Like I would just start going nuts. But so it is just engaging the brain on its own terms, right? The brain evolved to have all of these, it relies on these sensory systems to tell it about its environment. And so you need to deliver the information through those sensory systems. And then, I can't tell you if it's going to work for you, but something I've always had to do when I was trying to memorize, functional groups for organic chemistry or transcription factor, pathways for gene expression. That stuff is intrinsically pretty dry, pretty boring stuff. I had to connect it to, my broad motivation for why I'm even doing this in the first place. Why is it worth it to me? What is the ultimate reward of this activity? Be very, explicit about that. And then also, for me personally, it helped to anthropomorphize as much as I could. Right? We didn't really evolve to need to know the difference between an acetyl group and a methyl group, right? But we can. we did evolve certainly to be social primates. And so if you can inject some of that to what you're learning, that was helpful for me at least. I can't sleep in silence, always end up troubleshooting throughout the night. Yeah, so yeah, tweak nuts. For me, I now need a fan, which is basically I need white noise. Otherwise, I just get, disturbed. I have a question. With schools being so outdated and mundane, does this and will this affect children's brain function? Well, yes. I mean, the short answer is absolutely. Education is one of the primary mechanisms by which our brains are sculpted, right? By which our development is influenced. And yeah, frankly, I agree with you. Like, essentially the standard educational model reflects that of like 18th century or maybe 19th century England, which is, it doesn't mean it's bad. It's better than nothing, certainly. But, there's a lot of innovation in education. I was fortunate to benefit from one of those innovators just for the short period of time where he was at my high school. It's very, very difficult to educate rooms of children. Teachers are not paid remotely enough. They're dramatically overburdened with numbers of students. And so yeah, I mean, it's, in other words, it's not the teacher's fault, right? But yeah, I certainly think that there's room for improvement there. What's sulci and gyri? Or sulci and gyri, depending on with whom you're speaking. Those are the wrinkles on the outer layers of the brain, right? If you look at a human brain, let's say you were to take a mouse's brain or a rat's brain and you were to blow it up to the size of a human brain, right? Just imagine with me, I'm painting you a picture. And so they're the same exact size. They would be, slightly anatomically different, right? They have much more sort of like narrow brains, and they have much bigger olfactory bulbs than we do. And that makes sense. They're very olfactorily driven, right? They rely on their smell far more than we do. We barely do, compared to other mammals. But one of the first things you would notice, if you were to just look at any part of the two brains, is the fact that there are all these wrinkles on a human brain that are completely absent, except for arguably the cerebellum, in a rodent brain. And so, you might think, that's strange, and then just move on. But anatomically speaking, that is very, very important because, and actually, 50 points to Gryffindor for anybody who knows this answer. What is the evolutionary benefit or the anatomical benefit of having all those wrinkles? Does anybody know? Well, I'll tell you. It is increased surface area, right? So there's just more real estate available for more neurons to do more different things. And so that is an evolutionary advantage. It's very similar to why, we have all these ridges in our lungs. If you were to just flatten out the lung all the way, it would be gigantic, way bigger than the cavity in which it resides. Same is true with the human brain. We have all this real estate. So we don't have the most number of neurons. We are the most intelligent species. I think it's very uncontroversial to suggest. But we don't have the greatest number of neurons. We have about 86 billion. An elephant has over 260 billion. So why aren't they, building all these wonderful cities and doing all this wonderful art, writing all this wonderful music, and so on? Now, we don't know for sure. But one of the biggest differences is the number of neurons that compose our neocortex compared to that of an elephant. Right? Elephants have actually fewer neurons in their neocortex than humans do, despite the fact that they have way more neurons, broadly speaking, than we do. It's an interesting little aside, but that's why. So an gyri is the convex part, the outer part of the wrinkle. Sulcus or sulci or sulci is the little valley. That's usually more important to cognitive neuroscientists than it is beyond, outside. Is ADHD real? Is medication effective? So, ADHD is definitely one of the most controversial topics within psychiatry, and for a lot of good reasons. There have been some really good documentaries that have been done on the use of ADHD medications. And they would argue the excessive use of ADHD medications, particularly among, high school students and college students. It is shockingly common. It is actually, if I remember correctly, and this might be outdated, I think it's the second most common psychiatric disorder in children. It tends to occur more frequently in males than it does in females, although that difference, that chasm, is and smallening. It's shrinking. In other words, more girls are being diagnosed with ADHD these days. It is far more commonly diagnosed in the United States than it is outside of the United States for a variety of reasons, most of which almost certainly have nothing to do with biology. It is just more difficult to diagnose, or more stringently regulated to diagnose a kid with, let's say, ADHD in the United Kingdom than it is in the United States. Is it genetic? So it is highly heritable. So it has, so, in genetics, when you ask a question like, is any kind of behavior or, predisposition to a disease, is it genetic or is it environmental? There's a couple different tools in the utility belt of the Batman of geneticists. A couple of different tools available to a geneticist that is asked that question or is asking that question. One of the sort of gold standard tools, the golden hammer of a geneticist, is something called a twin study. And so that is just what it sounds like. You're studying twins. And so you're comparing, how frequently do two identical twins have a given condition, in this case ADHD, versus how common is it in fraternal twins. And so identical twins share 100% of their genomic DNA. They're indistinguishable, genomically speaking. And then fraternal twins share about 50%. And then just siblings that they're not twins, share even fewer of their genetics, right? And on you go until you get to people who are not related to each other directly, and you can compare again identical twins to those other populations. And if it's significantly more common among identical twins than it is among other combinations, then it's quite likely that genetics is playing a significant role. And of course, you're not just comparing one pair of identical twins to one pair of fraternal. You do this statistically, right? You collect as many as you possibly can, and you say, okay, among all of these collections of identical twins across all the entire world, or as broad a sample of the worldwide population as you can, how common is it for identical twins to have a condition, and is that greater or about equivalent to fraternal twins? And from those types of studies, we know that it has about 80% heritability, which is pretty high. So yeah, there is definitely a genetic component to ADHD. Studies have shown that genes that encode for things like the dopamine transporter, specific dopamine receptors, the norepinephrine. Okay, I've been listening to Robert Sapolsky, and he says norepinephrine, and so now I think norepinephrine. It's norepinephrine. The transporter for norepinephrine, as well as dopamine beta hydroxylase, which is the catalytic enzyme that converts dopamine into norepinephrine. And then other enzymes, catechol O-methyltransferase, which is responsible for breaking down dopamine. Now, you just heard me say a word quite a number of times, dopamine. And it seems that the dopaminergic signaling system is quite important for the manifestations of symptoms of ADHD. And wouldn't you know it, the only class of medications that has proven to be effective, the most effective, let's say, for people with ADHD, happens to interact with that exact signaling system. So Adderall and Ritalin, amphetamine and methylphenidate, both elevate catecholaminergic signaling, both of which dopamine and norepinephrine are among, right? They are both catecholamines. And so, unfortunately, other medications have been evaluated, like Strattera, for example, has been evaluated, which is a selective norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor, and it hasn't proven to be as effective as the classic ADHD medications. And then, of course, non-pharmacological interventions have also been tested, because there's definitely interest in being able to aid people diagnosed with ADHD to function, optimally in an educational setting without having to use medications. Totally get that. But unfortunately, they haven't proven to be as effective as the pharmacological intervention with psychomotor stimulants like amphetamine. Now, the best possible outcome is coupling pharmacological interventions, again, Adderall or Ritalin, with behavioral interventions, teaching study methods or that type of thing. If you couple the two, at least one study has shown that you can reduce the dose of the psychomotor stimulant necessary to derive the benefits of, or to reach the same level of efficacy as those who do not have a behavioral intervention and only have the pharmacological. They need to take higher doses to achieve that effect. Went into perhaps more depth there than was warranted. But have you read a book called The Fourth Way? Ospensky. No, I'll write it down though. Fourth Way. Thank you for the recommendation. I appreciate it. Okay, how can inflammation cause pain, and what causes inflammation? Oh man, that is a whole discipline within neuroscience. Inflammation is a very, very broad term. To put it succinctly, it is a byproduct of certain molecules and cells that are components of our immune system becoming active, right? And so you are probably quite familiar with inflammation if you're allergic to anything. If you're allergic to pollen or cats, right? You're having an inflammatory response. The only reason you know that you have an allergy is because you're having this inflammatory response to an allergen, not an actual pathogen, but those same systems that are engaged when you're exposed to cats or pollen or whatever you're allergic to, peanuts. Those are also components of the immune system that will enable you to get over a cold or the flu virus. But the inflammatory signaling is also engaged when you have an injury, right? When there's damage to your body. A lot of the same inflammatory, molecules that participate in fighting off the flu also participate in, the inflammation that occurs after you injure yourself. In fact, by the way, that's part of the reason for why aches, just general aches, are a symptom of the flu sometimes, depending upon the strain. So now those are examples of inflammation that are brought about by specific things, either exposure to an allergen or exposure to being injured, or being exposed to a pathogen, right? Now, inflammatory signaling can also be induced by something that has nothing to do with those systems. So, for example, arthritis, and also some neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease have shown to have substantial contributions by inflammatory signaling. There are some groups who would even go so far as to suggest that a lot of the damage induced by the aggregation of amyloid beta plaques in neurofibrillary tangles in Alzheimer's disease is attributable to inflammatory signaling. Even further, right, there are some groups who have evidence to suggest that migraines are a byproduct of inflammatory signaling, just non-specific inflammatory signaling. And then chronic pain, of course, absolutely is a byproduct of some inflammatory signaling somewhere caused by something, right? It could be, for example, caused by the fact that we're living longer and our backs didn't really evolve necessarily to fight the law of gravity for as long as we can these days. And so as a result, the cartilage, the lubrication essentially that keeps our vertebra from crunching against each other begin to fail, deteriorate, and they don't grow back, unfortunately. And so you can get inflammatory signaling because of those interactions. Now, what is the ingredient that causes the pain? There is a part of our sensory nervous system that literally senses pain. There are pain receptors. We call them nociceptors. Think noxious or obnoxious. These are obnoxious receptors, or nociceptors. And so when there's inflammatory signaling, nociceptors can become activated, and that is the system that we evolved to let us know that there's some threat. There's something just hit us. Something is compromising our ability to survive, and so we need to engage in some kind of behavior to ameliorate that pain, which is again our system telling us that there's something wrong with our body. So that's why we feel pain. That's why inflammatory signaling is painful. I say it's become a whole discipline within neuroscience. I mean, literally, there are tons of groups who are now interested in understanding inflammatory signaling in general, but also targeting the system, the inflammatory system, to do things like help us to live for longer periods of time, or to stave off the onset of dementia, or to stave off the manifestation of cardiovascular disease or heart disease. It is a very, very hot topic right now. What kind of receptors made you shave, brother? You mean, yeah, I used to have this very bad beard. They're the kind of receptors that are activated when I see my wife and I say, hey, do you want me to shave this beard yet? And she's like, no, don't do that. Anything but that. It was just time. I wanted to grow a beard at least one time before I reproduced. I have reproduced, and I don't want to torment the baby with any more than I already do here. Mu Kappa Delta, or Mu Kappa Delta. When I first read that, I was like, is that some kind of fraternity or sorority? I don't know. So actually, you know what? 20,000 points to Gryffindor for anybody who can share with the rest of the group what Mu Kappa Delta means, coming from JFKKKKK AGS the guy or the person with T as their icon. Mu, kappa, delta are a category of very specific things. Have you had a chance to read Dean Falk? I have not. I've been completely devoted to writing my dissertation. So unless he has written about the dorsal diencephalic conduction system, or addiction, or anxiety, or optogenetics or chemogenetics, I don't have that luxury at the moment. But Dean Falk, I'm writing down. Thank you for the recommendation, Euromaestro. Okay, and how? Does anybody know? Oh, so nobody knows. Okay, mu, kappa, delta, those are different opioid receptors. So, for example, hey, what's up, Zaina? Good to see you. Are a fellow neuroscience nerd from across the Great Atlantic. Anyways, mu, kappa, and delta are all... Actually, maybe, perhaps Zaina might be able to tell us what mu, kappa, delta would refer to. Well, I just said, I guess. They're different mu opioid receptors. And the mu opioid receptor is the primary receptor with which drugs like morphine, oxycodone, and fentanyl interact. So, give us more questions. Oh, you want me to quiz you guys? I could do that. I was actually thinking about doing that and asking people to potentially call in with their answers. Okay, yeah, okay, let's try. Okay, I'm gonna give this the old college try. Can anybody tell me how it is? And you're not allowed to look it up. Okay, I can't verify for sure. We're using the honor system right now. Not allowed to go on Google and look it up. Okay, we are celebrating knowledge. We're celebrating, the fact that we invested time in the past to learn this thing. Now, here's your question, and if you know the answer, please use the call-in feature on Twitter to call in, and then let's chat. And I will give you many, many points for Gryffindor if you get it. So, how does Botox work? Botox, the cosmetic, the thing that was developed for cosmetic purposes. It is used to eliminate wrinkles, or at least minimize wrinkles. Also has shown to be at least somewhat effective in people suffering from migraine. And it has a very specific physiological effect. So paralyzed muscle, you are right, but I want more specificity. If you're in my introductory to neuroscience class, I would give you a C- for that, because we covered this. No, I'm totally kidding. But, you're right, it is paralyzed muscle, but it does something very specific. Vascular. No, not vascular. Botox works via Hollywood producers forcing to fire actresses. I don't know about all that, but toxins that paralyze the muscle, it is injected in. That's indeed correct, but it does paralyze muscles, but it actually doesn't affect the muscle tissue itself, at least not directly. I heard somewhere that there's this condition, aka suicide disease, where the brain neurons aren't connected and they feel intense pain. I'm not familiar with that. I've never heard of a suicide disease. So poison. So Eleonora is hinting to the fact that Botox is derived from the botulinum toxin, derived from the thing that gives you botulism if you leave meat out for too long. I give up. Blocks nerve impulses. So Spiritus Maximus got it right. But how does it block nerve impulses? Paralyzed cell, yes. There's a very specific answer, and if you looked it up, then you would know what I'm talking about. Blocks the signals to the muscles. Blocks the acetylcholine receptor antagonist. Very close. That's an A- answer right there. Calcium channels, not quite. Okay, here's what it does. I won't belabor this any longer. It interferes with a complex of protein called the snare complex. And what the snare complex enables neurons to do is that as acetylcholine, specifically acetylcholine, as you were all correctly identifying, every time you move a muscle, acetylcholine is released to enable us to move the muscle. Every time you blink, every time you go like this, you do the eyebrow, Rocky, can you smell what the Rock is cooking thing? You are releasing acetylcholine that is binding to nicotinic acetylcholine receptors every single time you move a muscle. In the absence of acetylcholine release, binding nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, you will not be able to move a muscle. That is how Botox paralyzes muscles. But it is through this very interesting and unique mechanism, indeed, as Eleonora highlighted, derived from a toxin, that induces botulism. It inhibits the ability for the snare complex to promote vesicular fusion with the presynaptic membrane that then dumps acetylcholine out into the synapse. So it basically prevents acetylcholine from being released by blocking membrane fusion, vesicular membrane fusion. So 10 points for everybody that identified muscular paralysis. That's what I was going to say. I know that was a question I put as extra credit on one of the tests. As TAs, we had to write the test for Intro to Neuroscience, and I put it for extra credit. A lot of people got it. Okay, but it's rat poison, correct? No, well, I don't know. I don't know if the botulinum toxin is used as rat poison. I suspect it could be, but I mean, no, there's nothing. So what Botox is, if you were to look at the botulinum toxin, right? It's this. It looks a lot like an antibody, and it's basically just one subdomain of this broader molecule that inhibits, again, the fusion of vesicular membranes with presynaptic membranes to enable neurotransmitter release. Okay, do you know how Botox was found? Was it found while testing something else? I did learn this way in the past, but I've forgotten. I think that they were not trying to work on. I don't think they were trying to develop a paralytic agent. I think they were trying it for something else, and then they found that it had this effect and made probably way more money off of it than they would have otherwise. But it is an interesting story, and I've of course forgotten it. The presynaptic cleft, the presynaptic body. Yes, I completely care. I need this for next week's exams. Oh, lonely Janet. We have failed you. No, you didn't fail. I didn't get an A. Oh, I didn't see that you answered, Euro. How is the impulse generated in the brain? Very interesting topic. Well, generally speaking, if a neuron is firing an action potential or an impulse, it is either receiving enough signals from other neurons to pass a certain threshold beyond which it'll fire an impulse, or it's something that we might call a pacemaker neuron. So, for example, there are a couple neurons, even within the brain regions that I study, that are just spontaneously active. Just a couple bursts every second. And for example, that is part of how your cardiovascular rhythm is determined. There are just some neurons that just put out this regular discharge of impulses at baseline. And it's a byproduct of the composition of certain ion channels that enable certain ions to flow more or less effectively or easily from inside to outside and outside to inside of the neuron. But that is very, very... Google was opened, yeah. Anyways, we don't have to continue on with quiz time. All right, it's crazy how everything we do are a result of random neurons running around. It kind of, yeah. I don't know that I would use the term random. I know what you mean, right? It's messy, it's complicated, it's chaos, right? If you were to just slice open a brain and look at my brain with a microscope, and then I were to ask you, I want you to design an engine of consciousness, you would never design it the way the human brain is designed. But it's not random. Right? It evolved. Okay, we are getting a call from 1607er. And so let's see what he has for us. So what's your name and where are you calling from?
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. What's your name?
My name's Ian McLaughlin. I'm a PhD candidate in neuroscience. Do you have anything on your mind?
I don't know English.
I wish I knew other languages. I'm barely proficient in Spanish, but I think that sounds like we're not going to be able to interact. I'm sorry to say, but it's my fault, not yours. Yeah, sorry, man.
Me speak Turkey. I don't know English.
I know, and I don't know other languages. It's terrible, but sorry. I wish I had more insights for you. How do they know we are here? They're late. Does the snare protein affect muscle cramping? Interesting question. So again, the snare, the snare complex. It's a bunch of different proteins that kind of look like pipe cleaners. Right? They're these long, wispy sort of proteins that spin in with each other. They twist into each other, and some of those proteins are on the little the little containers of neurotransmitters that are the things that are trafficked to move neurotransmitters to different parts of the synapse. I suspect that it has, something like a muscle cramp has much more to do with the local biochemistry at the level of the muscle fiber rather than, excessive acetylcholine release. But I'm not 100% sure, to be completely honest. I don't do quizzes anymore. can STDs, an STD virus, affect the brain? In what way? Definitely. So actually, we are collaborating with the group studying the effect of HIV, right, the virus that causes AIDS, on the psychiatric status or the emotional status of the brain. There is a lot of evidence to suggest that HIV, sort of independently of the realization of the ramifications of being infected with HIV, goes above and beyond and induces depression. It's very tightly correlated with psychiatric distress. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the presence of many viruses, herpes simplex virus, HIV. I don't know about like the other less more acute viruses that are easily treated, like chlamydia or gonorrhea. I don't know if there's any evidence of them, but yeah. So even chlamydia, I haven't seen any evidence. I mean, we would have to assume it's untreated chlamydia because it's fairly easy to treat. But more so for viruses that inhabit you for the rest of your life, there's evidence to suggest that yes, they do affect the brain. Now, perhaps more frighteningly or shockingly, surprisingly, there are parasites that not only affect the body but also invade the brain and can reside in the brain for the entirety of your life. You wouldn't necessarily know it was there, but for oftentimes being admitted to the hospital for reckless behavior or a motorcycle accident or depression or psychiatric distress in general. And it just turns out that there is this strangely high correlation or enrichment of people who, for example, now I'm forgetting. Oh my gosh, this might be a sign that it's time to call it a day. Gosh, I can't believe I'm forgetting it. Well, you're observing maybe I'm infected with it. Plasma. That is brutal. I totally forgot. I did a whole live stream devoted to it. That's gonna torture me. Anyways, well, that's that topic. All right. How does an MAO inhibitor work? No, it's not Plasmodium. It is parasitosis. Yeah, it'll come back right when I finish. Toxoplasmosis. Thank you. Toxoplasma gondii. Okay, 1,000,000 points to Daisy Dog. 1,000,000 points to Gryffindor. Thank you for saving me. Yeah, so Toxoplasma gondii is a parasite that has this very interesting life cycle that it evolved basically because we live with cats. At least many of us do. Boo, Gryffindor. And it basically relies on you being exposed to the fecal matter of cats to then infect you. And it has some really interesting effects on rodent behavior, but it also seems to affect humans in very similar ways. But until we finish Toxoplasma gondii, where are you calling? What's your name and where are you calling from?
Hi, I'm from Vietnam.
And I assume you're well, I'll call you Bella from Vietnam. Very cool. What's on your mind?
I had a question about, I forgot the name, but it's a reactive attachment disorder, is it?
What was that? One more time?
When babies, it's a condition where babies don't receive enough love and care from their mother, for the neurons to connect or whatever.
So like attachment disorder?
Yeah, there's a name for it. RAD, I think. Also, conditions where, this might be a touchy subject, but children who are RAD and those kind of conditions, how does that actually affect? Oh, the other one was when the mum drinks alcohol while the baby's in the room.
Yeah.
Fetal alcohol syndrome, I think.
Yep.
How does that actually? I've always wondered, how does that actually affect the brain formation? I know that it doesn't connect, but how does that actually work?
Yeah, it's a really important topic. So I'm not quite sure what specific diagnosis you're referring to, but I mean there is a category, attachment disorder, where there's all kinds of abnormal psychology that can emerge from a child who was neglected. There are many forms of abuse that one can experience, particularly as a child, and neglect, parental neglect is one of them. And there is a sort of alarming frequency of people who are admitted to clinical settings for the treatment of addiction to drugs like heroin or methamphetamine or cocaine, who report having had childhood abuse of some sort, neglect being one of them, but it can also be sexual abuse or so on. And so, I mean, so how does that affect the brain? I mean, it's a very broad effect, right? So I can tell you, I just had a kid, and their entire universe is you, right? I mean, they look to you for everything. If you're not around, they get upset, right? They can only tolerate your absence for so long. And, it's not like she has any choice. It's not like she's deciding that she wants me nearby. It's that we evolved such that there's this concept of the fourth trimester, where after the baby's born, they're still 100% dependent upon you. And, basically you are attached at the hip, or at least for women, oftentimes at the boob, right? And so if you deprive a child of that, social interaction, of that nurturing, of that source of comfort, the early childhood, traumatic experiences like that, oftentimes they're referred to as adverse life experiences, we know correlates significantly with, the frequency, for example, of psychosis, right? So just for example, if a child or if a person had 3 childhood adverse life experiences, they're 3 times more likely to experience psychosis than somebody who didn't. And I mean, I can't tell you a specific neuronal population that changes in a specific way. It's more of a broad, altering of the trajectory of a child's neuronal development. Now, when it comes to alcohol, however, fetal alcohol syndrome, which, as you described, is when a pregnant woman drinks alcohol, that is actually quite a bit more common in the United States than I thought, particularly among lower income communities, unfortunately. But alcohol, ethanol, has sort of uniquely broad pharmacology. It interacts with a lot more, parts of the brain than a drug like, amphetamine does. It modifies GABAergic signaling, it modifies glutamatergic signaling, it modifies serotonin, opioid, even endogenous cannabinoid signaling. And basically, just like if somebody takes, let's say they drink alcohol regularly for, 20 years, their brain is going to be fundamentally changed because the brain becomes accustomed to the presence of the drug, modifies numbers of receptors, and so on. When a brain is developing, the developmental trajectory of the child is going to be fundamentally changed, because for certain neurons to form connections, this neuron needs to be active and send signals to this neuron. And if you have alcohol inhibiting that interaction, that connection may or may not form. And so as a result, you have somebody who's born with fetal alcohol syndrome, which correlates very, very strongly with inhibited intellectual development, as measured by like lower IQ scores, impulse control problems, all of these various behavioral disorders that manifest from their brain being fundamentally changed, and it's essentially lifelong, right? Sorry, my battery died, but thank you for answering. Oh no, thank you for calling in. Really interesting topic, and really cool to hear from somebody in Vietnam. So yeah, was there anything else I wanted to mention? Fetal alcohol syndrome. I mean, it's one of those things, like I remember when I was in high school, I remember hearing conversations between adults. I was in Miami. I don't know if that plays any role. That, we're arguing like, oh, it's fine to have, a couple glasses of wine when you're pregnant because so little of the alcohol penetrates the placental barrier, which is true. But think about how many neurons are in a fetus's developing brain, right? A little bit of the drug will go quite a long way. And, the reality is there is no amount of alcohol that is healthy nor benign. And I mean, I drink alcohol, so, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to, speak down to anybody here. But for the longest time, we had this concept of alcohol as being essentially benign. Hey, it's legal after all. It can't be nearly as bad for you as amphetamine or heroin. And in fact, physiologically speaking, alcohol is worse for you than heroin. But that's just not the case. So if anybody's pregnant, you definitely should not drink alcohol. I don't think wine is good for you at all. Alcohol is not good in any form. Yeah, I mean, I'm not just saying that like I think that, like, or I speculate that. There have now been some of the biggest studies that have ever been done that were done in the UK, which, if you're from the UK, I don't have to tell you, has a very healthy pub culture, let's say, that basically showed, for the longest time, the accepted wisdom was that, mild to moderate amounts of alcohol consumed regularly is benign, and some would even go so far as to suggest it's potentially beneficial, right? Maybe by reducing susceptibility to stress, or reducing anxiety, or if you're drinking wine, perhaps it's a good delivery system of resveratrol, the antioxidant. And resveratrol, there is good evidence to suggest that it is beneficial, but basically, the biggest statistical epidemiological studies have shown that even mild amounts of alcohol consumed regularly are associated with only health detriments. Now, does that mean I will never drink alcohol? No. The top priority of my life is not to live forever, right? It's to try and embrace every opportunity to have enriching experiences, or to be able to deliver wisdom through my experience to my child or children, hopefully. And it's to enjoy the fact that, we're only here for a short period of time, and you only have so many opportunities to interact with other humans, and alcohol can play a lovely role in sort of fostering a unique repertoire of interactions and behaviors. So, I don't think it's a question of like, oh, well, if it's bad for you, you definitely shouldn't have any of it. It's more, you shouldn't drink it under the assumption that it's good for you or even benign. Epilepsy, could you explain it? Brian May, it would be my pleasure. So epilepsy is actually, it's a condition that has been studied for a very long time. Some of the oldest clinical literature was about, status epilepticus. And basically, it's a condition where there's recurrent seizures. Seizures are an inappropriate frequency of neuronal impulse, occurrence, or frequency of action potential firing. And it can occur in different parts of the brain. Now, most of us are familiar with epilepsy via convulsive epilepsy, or convulsive status epilepticus, and that is when somebody loses their ability to control their muscle activity, and they begin convulsing. They begin, rhythmically contracting their muscles uncontrollably, and it can be quite alarming, because it's such a departure from what a person normally does that, what's wrong? But that is just one category of epilepsy, or status epilepticus. There are many other forms of epilepsy that can manifest depending upon where in the brain the seizure is occurring. So, for example, there is such a thing as absence seizures, where somebody just sort of zones out, and they haven't passed out. They're still, awake, but they're totally unresponsive to their environment. They have no sympathetic activation, or I shouldn't say it that way actually, but they just won't respond. You can do that, and they're just very potently zoned out. There's something that's sometimes called drop seizures, where it's sort of like the flip side of a convulsant seizure, where people lose the ability to contract their muscles at all, and therefore they can just drop. They can fall to the ground. And then there's a whole category of status of non-convulsive status epilepticus that seems to be associated with potentially psychiatric conditions, and that is this whole very alluring to me population of patients who may come into the hospital engaged the clinical clinician because they are depressed, or because they're experiencing psychosis, or they have bipolar disorder. They get medicated for those things, and then for one reason or another, their physician, perhaps because the treatment isn't effective, their physicians strap on an EEG, and they find, oh my gosh, you're having these seizures that we had no idea what was happening, because you weren't convulsing, you weren't losing consciousness, you weren't having auras, you weren't seeing colors or smelling things, but these seizures are still there. And so perhaps that could be part of the etiology of your depression or bipolar disorder. So for me, that's very interesting. But broadly speaking, that's what epilepsy is. It's just it is a category of brain-related conditions that arise because there's inappropriate patterns of neuronal activation throughout the brain. So yeah, great topic. Okay, let's see. Where are we? Okay, so the effects of taking 300 milligrams of gabapentin 2 times daily, overall effect and negative aspects. So, this is kind of a conversation you should have with whomever is prescribing the gabapentin. It's not like there is, apart from an overdose, it's not like there is again, apart from overdose, apart from taking so much that it interferes with your nervous system in a dangerous way. It all depends upon the condition that you're using it to treat, the size of your body fat composition, and your tolerance to gabapentin. Gabapentin, very similar to another medication called pregabalin, are essentially, you can kind of think of them, and it's not quite completely true. It's not quite completely accurate, but GABA, the inhibitory neurotransmitter, which is responsible for, if you were to imagine whether or not a neuron is going to fire an impulse, it's sort of like a tug of war between something that is, pulling this way, which could be glutamate, the on signal, the activation, excitatory neurotransmitter, pulling against GABA, which is the other side of the tug of war, which is inhibitory or inactivating. It makes it more difficult for a neuron to fire an impulse. And GABA, the neurotransmitter itself, is incapable of traversing this protective layer we have around our brain called the blood-brain barrier, which protects our brain from being invaded by molecules in our bloodstream that may or may not need to be there, right? So GABA itself, unless you take massive doses of GABA, none of it is really getting into your central nervous system. But if you tweak the GABA molecule in this way or that, and by the way, that means that essentially all the GABA in your brain is synthesized locally. It's synthesized within your brain. So don't take any GABA supplements thinking that you're boosting your brain's GABA, because you're really not. But okay, if you just alter the molecule in this way or that, then you can make a form of GABA, or at least a molecule that can sort of masquerade a little bit like GABA that is capable of getting into your brain, and that is kind of a way to think of pregabalin and gabapentin. These are medications that can be used, by the way, to treat in some cases, seizures, but they have also been shown to be somewhat effective as an adjunct treatment, somewhat effective for the treatment of chronic pain when combined with other analgesics, enabling people to reduce the dose of the opioid analgesic that they're taking. Now, as with essentially any GABAergic drug, alcohol, benzodiazepines, barbiturates, all of which have slightly different pharmacologies, by the way, but they all share one thing in common, which is amplifying GABA signaling. Much like with any of those drugs, one can form a chemical dependence very rapidly to gabapentin and pregabalin, which the withdrawal from which can be extraordinarily unpleasant and potentially dangerous. So it's not, these aren't really the kinds of drugs that you want to treat with, frivolity. Okay. But, I know that doses of pregabalin and gabapentin, I think both, are like remarkably high. Like, people take like a gram of it a day. It's kind of odd that way. As opposed to like alprazolam, where people will take like 2 milligrams a day. So it's not like you should, be disturbed by a certain number. That is, it's more about efficacy. Generally speaking, gabapentin and pregabalin are not prescribed just to, you need help sleeping, right? So, which drug should we treat with frivolity? Caffeine. Okay, so there was an awesome topic. Oh yeah, is propensity to addiction a genetic component? So MSEN LA, or Ms in LA, I find that to be an extremely fascinating topic, not the least of which, one of the reasons being that my lab participates in research specifically in this topic. Or I should say the lab in which I work, the lab to which I belong. And I have a podcast. It's called Wired to Be Weird, and it's on iTunes and Stitcher and Spotify. Wired to Be Weird, and this is one of the episodes that we devoted the podcast to, which is addiction a genetic disease, or is addiction a disease? Actually, because that's another debate that sort of butts up against: is there a significant genetic component to it, like many other diseases have, or is it not a disease? Is it a disorder? So if you're interested in a fairly comprehensive dive into this debate, and by the way, I try and steelman the argument with which I disagree as much as possible, right? There are some very prominent neuroscientists who argue that it is a disorder and not a disease. Carl Hart over at Columbia being among the most prominent. Now, is there a genetic component to addiction? Yes. I mean, you would have to, you'd have to purposefully look for people that are, addiction neuroscientists who argue that there's no genetic component to it. And the only time I've seen somebody make that claim, that there is no evidence of any genetic component to addiction, is when it's clear that they just haven't read the literature. Like, they just are unaware. Like, you would never make that claim because, if you wanted to responsibly and convincingly make that claim, then you would say there's some evidence to suggest that there's a genetic component to it, but it's not strong enough. It's not sufficient to suggest that that it is a genetic component. In science, you need to amass many, many studies conducted by different groups with different people using different methods to make a confident claim that X, Y, or Z is true, right? And you wouldn't even phrase it that way if you're being responsible in science. Okay, just hang on the line there, Daniel, and we'll get to that topic next. I just want to finish this one up. Now, I happen to disagree with that assertion that there's not enough evidence. I think there's plenty of evidence indicating that there is a very significant component of genetics, or genetics is a very significant component of addiction. For example, I can, if you do a 23andMe type of profiling, or you send your genetic material to me, and I sequenced your genome at certain parts of your genome, I can predict whether or not you smoke cigarettes. I can predict how many cigarettes you smoke. I can predict how hard it's going to be for you to quit smoking, and on and on. That's just for nicotine alone. We could do the same for alcohol. We can do the same for opioids. And so the question as to whether or not there's any genetic component of addiction at all is answered. Yes, there is definitely a genetic component to it. The more interesting question now is just how dominant of an influencing factor is genetics, and that is an ongoing discussion. Even for me, like somebody who is very strong or I make very strong claims on this topic, I think that there is a very, very significant, perhaps even dominant role played by the environment in determining whether or not somebody's susceptible to addiction. And when I say environment, that's also like life experiences, childhood, development, upbringing, parenting, education, all that kind of stuff. I believe, Daniel, is that your name? Where are you calling from? Are you there, Daniel?
Yeah. I'm good night first. I'm from Croatia.
Oh, cool.
And it's quite late here. Yeah, I'm in my night shift. So I have one question for you. It's maybe not a neuroscientific one. It's more of a philosophical, but it kind of relates to the subject, and I would appreciate to hear your opinion on that matter.
I'll do my best.
So a few days ago, I saw an interview in which Elon Musk, the guy?
Yeah.
Yeah. He stated that an internet today, as it is, especially in relation with all of our social networks, it's almost like a primitive simulation of our brain. Our likes, our thoughts, our desires, if you will. And he said that as the internet power increases, and it's bound to happen quite soon with the 5G network, that it is not so impossible that in foreseeable future an internet actually develops something that could make him as sentient.
Oh,
What is
I
your
see.
opinion on that?
I see. I thought you were going in a slightly different direction. So I should say just up front, I have a podcast, Wired to be Weird. We talked specifically about one of Elon Musk's companies, Neuralink, as a sort of basis for the concept of whole brain computer interfaces. And so, if you're interested in a deep dive on that topic, check it out. Let me know what you think. So, I mean, broadly speaking, yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think it's safe to say that technology has sort of become an external component of the human brain, right? I don't think I could function in science absent a laptop or absent, my electronic devices. And for me, it's tough to know whether. I mean, it sounds sort of like the claim there was that the internet could give rise to an artificial intelligence, like a general artificial intelligence, and perhaps, I mean, I'm fairly confident that we will eventually develop an artificial intelligence that will surpass human intelligence. But for me, I think given that it is certainly possible for us to develop whole brain computer interfaces that enable, humans to interact with computers at a very rudimentary level now, but in the not too distant future, in a much more sophisticated way. I mean, I think absolutely that the boundaries between human consciousness and the internet will begin to dissolve a bit. And so, yeah, I mean, I agree. And I assume, so two more things, and then I'll stop talking. The first is Neuralink, his company that he founded. The board of this company is composed of some serious neuroscientists and neuroengineers. So, it's not just Elon Musk. He's sort of the face of it, which kind of makes sense. I mean, he's a pretty notorious guy. He can raise a lot of money. So, their aspirations are not trivial, right? They're working hard at this. But then the second is that they all the board members that have been interviewed, including Elon Musk, when asked, is there like a science fiction that you would sort of suggest accurately recapitulates what you imagine in the future, they all highlight this book series written by an author named Ramez Nam called The Nexus Trilogy. I've read it. I think it's excellent, and I totally agree with their highlighting of that science fiction as a somewhat viable realization of, or I should say, depiction of this technology being realized. But so what do you think, Daniel?
Well, honestly, my opinion is that the problem that might occur is that by the time we begin to realize just how deep we went into this funnel of ever-increasing technology and its abilities, it will be, I'm afraid, too late.
I mean, I completely agree with you. I mean, well, I agree with you that is a concern, and it warrants our attention, the attention of scientists and technologists, and I should say that is one of the prime motivations for this group of scientists in collaboration with Elon Musk to help to expedite the integration of technology into our brains, because that'll really be the only way that human intelligence would be able to compete with a much more sophisticated artificial intelligence. So, rest assured that there are some people who are working on some solutions to that problem, Daniel. But I agree with you completely that it is a valid concern.
Yeah, thanks for your answer.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Thanks for calling in, Daniel. Cool stuff. I love science fiction. Was literally like, I was a science fiction nerd from the age of 11, and my library, it's just one big bookcase. It's just stuffed with only science fiction. My wife has some books too. They're not. You can tell who's or who's. Okay, I think I'm going to call it a day there. I have a podcast, as I mentioned. It's called Wired to Be Weird, and it's on iTunes and Stitcher and Spotify and Google Play and Anchor, and I could go on and on. Give it a listen. Let me know what you think. If you have the time, we would really appreciate a 5-star rating on iTunes. I know it's awkward to have to go through all the hoops that they put in front of you, but it would really help us to get more earballs on our podcast. And then also, I know not everybody's in a position to do so, but if you are in a position to contribute some financial support, I have a Patreon. It's called patreon.com/anthropoid. And if you are capable of doing so, I look forward to setting up some time where I can speak more one-on-one about a topic that you're interested in, that you would like for me to digest the technical information in a way that is intelligible and at least moderately coherent to the best of my abilities. Otherwise, I will see you next week, same place, around the same time. Same corner of my apartment, and until then, I hope you have an excellent week. Excellent week. See you guys. All right, YouTube. This was all recorded, so now I'm going to upload to YouTube, assuming that it is not still down. Yeah. Anyways, I keep doing that, and my microphone is on the table, which is very bad broadcasting etiquette. Anyways, if you have any suggestions about how I ought to be using this space on YouTube, I really enjoy the sort of loose form kind of interaction, but I am trying to improve the more curated stuff up front so that people don't have to slog through a whole conversation to get to the parts that are interesting to them. But I am, I would love any input that you have. Either just leave it in the comment section, or you can email me, anthropoid, or it's probably easier to tweet at me @_anthropoid. But you can also email me, anthropoidemail@gmail.com, and you can get all that stuff through my website, anthropoid.science, not .com, .science. So I look forward to hearing from you. See you next time.